Hello, everyone, and welcome to Talk Nerdy. Today is Monday, March 31st, 2025, and I'm the host of the show, Dr. Cara Santa Maria. And as always, before we dive into this week's episode, I want to thank those of you who make Talk Nerdy possible week after week. Remember, this show is and will always be 100% free to download. And the way that we're able to do that is by relying on the support of individuals just like you. If you can afford to support the show, you enable those who cannot to be able to enjoy this content for free. If you would like to support the show on an episodic basis, all you have to do is visit patreon.com/talknerdy. That's patreon.com/talknerdy. This week's top patrons include Anu Bhadavaj, Daniel Lang, David J.E. Smith, Mary Neva, Brian Holden, David Compton, Gabrielle F. Jaramillo, Joe Wilkinson, Joseph Lamore, Pasquale Gelati, Rika Maharaj, and Ulrika Hagman. Thank you all so much. All right, let's get into it. This week, I had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Gina Rippon. She is Emeritus Professor of Cognitive Neuroimaging at the Aston Brain Center, where she uses brain imaging techniques to investigate patterns of brain activity in developmental disorders such as autism. And she has a brand new book out called Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. So without any further ado, here she is, Dr. Gina Rippon. Well, Gina, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you very much for asking me.
I am looking forward to talking about your new book, Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. I think it's a really important topic. It's one that's quite relevant to my own work as well. But before we get in too deep to the topic, I would love to learn a little bit more about you. So you're a cognitive scientist. So you are coming at this topic, which is, quite a clinical topic from both a clinical perspective, but mostly your experiences on the research side as well, right?
Yes, that's correct. So effectively, I'm in common parlance, a brain imager. So I use different kinds of brain imaging techniques, but I'm very interested not only in the characteristics of brain activity, but also how they relate to behavior, which is the kind of cognitive bit of the label.
And do you have a specialty in particular imaging techniques, or do you kind of do them all?
I have done them all, but my most specialized one is called magnetoencephalography, or MEG, you'll be pleased to hear for short, which looks at the magnetic fields associated with brain activity. So very, very precise measurements at very, very short timescales, which actually looks at brain function more effectively than MRI looks at structures, for example.
Yeah, so we often, when we think about imaging, we think about, pictures of the brain for clinical purposes, whether we're talking about CT or a PET scan or, like you mentioned, an MRI. We hear a lot in research about fMRI, about functional MRI. Tell us a little bit about how MEG is different from fMRI.
The timescale resolution is a lot finer, so you can actually look at changes which happen in milliseconds, which, if you think about it, most of our behavior does happen in milliseconds, if you think about language or listening to people speaking, for example. And the other advantage for MEG is that the signal is very clear, much clearer than with EEG, for example. So we get a very good measure of where the changes are coming from, but also when they're happening.
It's interesting because I think I can't speak for the audience, but my assumption is that most people listening right now, have heard about fMRI. They've noticed that fMRI and even EEG are very common measures that they'll read about in papers or in kind of science news. But if MEG is so much more, precise to the time scale, why don't we hear about it more?
That's a great question. Well, initially, because it requires, you have to be in a magnetically shielded room, because the magnetic fields from the brain are tiny, absolutely minuscule. So any magnetic field in the room, for example, in the world, would overwhelm the signals from the brain. So initially, you had to have a very expensive system set up in a magnetically shielded room. And it also required a sort of constant flow of helium. So the actual system itself uses helium. So it was A, very expensive, and B, not user friendly, if you like. But we have now started to find sensors that you can use in the outside world that don't require magnetic shielding. That's in the last couple of years. So
Oh, wow.
hopefully, in the next few years, we will start to see MEG becoming as used as commonly as fMRI and EEG.
And does it require any sort of like injection, any tracers? Is it comfortable for the participant?
That is its major use, especially for people like me, because if you're interested in testing children, for example, the fact that you don't need any markers of any kind, and now you can use it in the outside world with it is a weird looking helmet, but it does allow, for example, children to be playing or interacting with their carer or something like that. So that makes it again a much more user friendly system.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, because I know, I mean, I haven't done too much work with littles, but I know they're not good at sitting still. So, being able to be out and about and doing what you're doing and still get a clean scan is probably a massive advantage.
Indeed.
So I'm curious then, your kind of specialty is in neuroimaging. You're interested in how neuroimaging and behavior, obviously, there's that side of it, right? Not just, oh, look, here are some pretty pictures, but what's actually happening in the brain and what can that tell us about who we are as human beings and how we behave in the world. Autism specifically, is this one of many areas that you sort of dug into throughout your career, or was it a pretty consistent area of focus for you?
I think overall, my career is about how brains get to be different, any kind of brains. So, way back in the mists of time, I did a PhD looking at schizophrenia and the schizophrenic experience. But I've always been very interested in people whose behavior or cognitive skills are somehow different. So, I've also looked at dyslexia, for example, which is, an atypical cognitive problem that some children have. The autism thing is probably for the last decade of my career been the most consistent focus of my research.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah, and this kind of question about neurodivergence and what does it mean? This I think there's so many layers that we'll probably be able to get into here, both from sort of the more, I guess, the imaging perspective to the gender differential, which is an important topic that we will be getting deep into, but also just this question of like autism as a brain type and as an experience of just neurodivergence versus the historical view. And I'm a psychologist, so autism is still in the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, right? And so we still, to some extent, even though it has been adjusted and iterated over time, view this as a syndrome, view this as a disability. And so that change in the kind of autism community towards, I guess, talking about these things as divergences as opposed to disabilities is quite interesting.
I think that's exactly right. And you picked up on the problems about referring to it as a disability. To be fair to the kind of autism diagnosticians, way back in the 1940s, when, although there is a footnote to that comment, way back in the 1940s, it was quite a characteristic of children with quite profound behavioral difficulties, and still is, because we talk about a spectrum. And at one end of the spectrum, there are children with what is called profound autism, or a different term I've come across more recently, frank autism, where there are very marked behavioral problems, quite severe intellectual disability, in which case the term disorder, I think, is appropriate. But the idea is very often now that we refer to autism spectrum condition rather than autism spectrum disorder. And that's thanks very strongly to the neurodiversity movement, which you mentioned, whereas autism isn't a mental health problem, it's not a mental illness. It's the consequences of perceiving the world differently, sometimes to the extent that you don't fit into that world because that world doesn't understand that you perceive it differently. But it's to do with effectively just having a brain which doesn't respond to the outside world in the way that neurotypical individuals do.
It's interesting because when I think about mental health, or I think about kind of this psychology world, the world that I live in, and the world that you have quite a bit of crossover with, I also think about then neuroscience and psychiatry and neurology and sort of the medical model. And I'm trying to formulate a question here clearly, but this idea of a syndrome versus something that is pathognomonic, something that is a disease state or a clear disorder. You know, somebody has a stroke in this region of their brain, they have a deficit or a decrement in behavior in that region, and we can specifically say it's due to this. When we talk about syndromes like autism, like schizophrenia, they have such a wide range of variability, and really so much of this is a categorization problem, isn't it? We're trying to label something that's not very clear.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you've put your finger on the whole problem of psychiatric diagnosis, actually. And the consequence of the latest iteration of the diagnostic manual that you mentioned is that there is this huge range of different patterns of behavior, which now come under the heading of autism spectrum condition or disorder. And
Mhm.
therefore, the classic statement, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism, really does hold true. Which of course reflects very much the nature of autism, but it does mean that if you're trying to do research into it in any particular genre, it could be behavioral, it could be nutritional, for example, if you like, or genetic or neuroimaging, like myself, it's very difficult to pin down, to try and get a consistent group together.
Yeah.
Because if you want to look at, 100, 200, thousands, we're now looking at brain imaging studies, the actual presentation of the condition is very different in those thousand or so people.
You know, I think about too this experience in the world, and this is, I don't know, it's not a critique, it's an open question, but this experience in the world of going through life feeling like there's something about you that doesn't quite fit in with what's expected, with what's normative, right? So we've got individuals who struggle every day with depression, with anxiety. At what point is this a depressive, quote, disorder? At what point does this qualify for generalized anxiety disorder? At what point is this the experience of being a human being and the spectrum of just differences? And one of the ways that we kind of just have arbitrarily said there's a cutoff from a psychology perspective, like I'm thinking about my job now as somebody who both diagnoses and treats, is do you experience a sort of functional deficit? Do you find that it makes it hard to be successful in your relationships? Do you find that it makes it hard to be successful in school? Do you find that it makes it hard to be successful at work, right? Do you have clinically significant impairment in these different areas? Is How do you feel about that sort of being the new threshold for whether somebody is diagnosed or whether they're just sort of viewed as somewhat neurodivergent, but that they don't have a disorder? Because I see this a lot. I meet people in my everyday life and they're like, I think I might be on the spectrum. I think I might be autistic. And I'm like, you would not qualify for a diagnosis because you don't have significant impairment.
I think the impairment issue is key. And it's, of course, built into the sort of diagnostic process with respect to autism. And in fact, with all mental health issues, how much does it interfere with your everyday life? And with autism, there are levels of severity. So part of the process is, does this person need constant care and is likely to need that all their lives? Does this person need some kind of special consideration, but they could still manage to to carry on with their everyday life? Or is this just a measure of a particular type of difficulty you have or difference that you have, which doesn't interfere that much with your everyday life? But clearly, it interferes enough that you've asked the question or somebody has suggested you ask the question.
Yeah, yeah. And you're right. I think that first comment about do you need help? Do you need care? And at what level is that care is a way that at least the architects of the DSM have tried to sort of categorize and say, okay, we're going to talk about severity, and that severity is going to be based on these different impairments and how much care you need. So let's dig into it a little bit. When we categorize based on the DSM, there are basically two main areas now, right? Because this is evolved so much over time. But there are basically two main areas that we focus on, if somebody's giving an assessment and working towards a diagnosis. And those areas are kind of social over here, and then like restricted or repetitive patterns of behavior over there. And then there's like other things we think about, when did this first come about? Were you young? Was it in your early developmental period? Is there clinically significant impairment, like we mentioned? And is something else better explaining, these patterns of behavior? But the main two are social communication and social interaction, and then restricted and repetitive patterns of behavior. So let's get into that. Do you focus on both of those areas in your research? Does one interest you more than the other? Does one map to neuroimaging better than the other?
Yes. Well, I was going to say yes, yes, and
Oh,
no.
okay.
Sorry. I mean, it's really intriguing once you look at the currently two columns, if you like, or pillars of what constitutes autism. Because I think the first chapter in the book is what is autism, and I think at the end of it, the editor said, so you've spent 7,000 words telling me nobody knows.
Right. It's always
But
the case,
yes,
right?
but the focus is firstly on social behavior, social interaction, what I call social instinct, if you like. And of course, the whole story of autism has really been about that, because when it was first publicly discussed or presented as a clinical condition by people like Kanner and others, the focus was on this kind of aloof characteristic. I mean, Kanner in particular said these children don't seem to have the need for any kind of effective contact. So they seemed sort of withdrawn, silent, didn't respond to normal sort of social gestures, etc. So that's always been the core characteristic of autism, and of course that's what the name means, and it is actually the name that's reflected in the names for autism across the world in different languages. Deliberately alone or isolated or etc. So that's one part. The other part is almost completely different, because it's very much focusing on, as its term talks about, restricted patterns of behavior, very, very limited areas of interest, huge amount of focus, absolute terror of change, etc. So they are oddly two completely different presentations. And there was a phase about 20 years ago where there was a triad of impairments, and sort of language was put in there as a sort of special characteristic. And then people were saying these don't go together. We have people with one kind of difficulty who show the characteristic repetitive behaviors, stimming, head banging or hand flapping, etc. And other people who have very intense difficulty with social interaction. So at a behavioral level, I think that's a bit of a conundrum that hasn't really been dealt with. The focus has been on the social bit, but actually the presentation, the difficulties that people encounter is very often more to do with their stimming or their inability to cope with change, etc. Added to which is now, and I think that's quite interesting, in the last iteration of the diagnostic manuals, the kind of sensory sensitivity. And I think that's actually very interesting. But the way my particular theory in the group that I've been working with is, and as a neuroimager, to come back to your question about, which bit works best, is the idea that our brains are what I call predictive coders, or like predictive text systems. So brains are not just responding to information as it arrives. Brains are building out algorithms. So much more like the kind of AI we're encountering now. As we're born, as we acquire information in the world, as we grow up in the world, our brains are constantly monitoring what's in that outside world and what happened when, the owner of the brain encountered that information. So it becomes a bit like a sat nav, where it's, coming up to a particular turn that needs to be made. The brain is actually providing us with information, with rules that have been generated by past experience. That's how we get through the world. That's how we don't have to process everything in the world, because our brains have sort of sorted out what we need to respond to, what we don't need to respond to. If we didn't have that, then the way in which my colleagues and I feel is happening in the autistic brain is this is a brain which doesn't make predictions. So every new encounter is a new encounter. There's no past experience that brain can draw on. So every tiny little change in a social situation or a sensory, a sound or a light, can cause huge amounts of disturbance.
Is that sort of the idea, that they don't have heuristics? Like, they just don't make these sort of, I guess, to a certain extent, because there's always going to be some heuristic, but that these patterns that they can sort of map to and say, "Oh, this is just an iterative version of that other thing that I know how to manage."
Yes, exactly right. I mean, heuristics that's a great phrase. I mean, in the sort of brain imaging community, they talk about generating predictions. So the brain says, in this particular situation, this facial expression, this tone of voice, this body language should lead you to understand that this person is very upset or very angry or very pleased to see you, etc. So you don't have to go through all of the checks and tick boxes to work out what's going on. It's done for you. But if you don't have that, then the world is very frightening, because it's a bit like, landing in a foreign country with no knowledge of the language or the customs, or how to make yourself understood, really. And I think in the book, one of the people I spoke to, refers to it as like being an undercover agent dropped it, behind enemy lines without actually any training in how you should be behaving or things to look out for, etc.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think about some of the misunderstandings about autism, and I think one of the really big ones is, coming back to kind of the social interaction, not even so much social communication, not even so much the repetitive patterns of behavior or the insistence on sameness, but this question of interest. We talk about, okay, I look at some diagnostic criteria, look at like the MIG-DOS or the ADOS, like these different tests that we use in psychology to evaluate. Okay, does this person understand an idiom? Can they explain to me what this means, or do they give me a really concrete answer? Okay, fine. I ask them about their sensitivity to tags and fabrics and tight shoes and all that. Okay, that's gonna tell me something. But very often there's this idea that if somebody, I don't know, if they feel like odd, like they're not reading my social cues, they're not reading my smile or my frown, or they're not making a lot of eye contact, that they don't want to, as opposed to there's a difference in how they process it. And from what I've learned from most of the people that I've talked to in my career who are autistic, they desperately want to have relationships, and they are working really hard at making sure that they can maintain their friendships, or that they have a close relationship with their parents, for example, but they struggle with how to do it.
I don't know if I can ask you this question. Is that to do more with females that you've spoken to than with males?
I think I have seen it in both. What I've found is the main difference, and sorry to like spoiler alert on the things we'll get to soon, but the main difference I found is that women are trained in how to mask socially from the time they're young. So my female patients have just been better at like it's harder to diagnose them with autism because the diagnostic criteria favor men, and women just can feign the eye contact better, and they can feign all of these social cues better because as a gender, society teaches us that stuff earlier and more thoroughly. So even the people who have, quote, deficits or differences in that area, they have a shortcut, right? Whereas men, I think they just have a handicap in that area because neurotypical men are not taught a lot of these social communication skills, right? So then what do you expect with somebody who is neurodivergent? But I definitely have had plenty of young boys who they're like, I want to be his friend. I want to spend time with so and so. But but then they feel like the connection is,
Yeah.
or they'll be like, we are friends. And it's very funny because I'm like, if you were to ask the other kid, they're like, no, that's just some kid I know.
Yes.
But they're like, no, we're very good friends. So there's a disconnect
Yeah.
there.
I think that's great because I probably now feel I shouldn't have asked you the question in terms of more boys and girls because I think it is more common in females, and this is certainly the core of the book, which is about the fact that there's a very high incidence of camouflaging or masking in the female autistic population, but there's a huge amount of variability. So, at one level of the female autistic population, they are so similar to the kind of patterns of behavior of the male autistic population that they are, in inverted commas, strongly successful in passing the autism test.
Yeah.
So, way back in time, as it were, the very few girls, and there have always been girls on the spectrum, but vanishingly few. The way they got on the spectrum sounds. The fact that
Right. The way they were diagnosed, I suppose.
they were diagnosed. That's right. Was because they were like the characteristic autistic individuals who were being diagnosed as autistic, i.e., males. So I think the point you made was, that there are little boys who desperately want to be friendly, but it's certainly once this whole awareness, not only by looking at the autistic population, but by looking at people who weren't diagnosed as autistic until a lot later, once people started listening to their experiences and what they were doing as they grew up and what the experiences they had as they grew up, it was clear that there was and I hesitate to use the word type of autistic behavior, which was very different from the characteristic picture in that they really, really desperately wanted to be social, and they developed all sorts of strategies to try and fit in because social rejection, and this might get onto later in the kind of what's going on in the brain, affects them very strongly, less strongly than it affected males at that point who were diagnosed as on the spectrum. So all of these individuals had problems with social interaction. One lot didn't seem so motivated to do something about it, whereas the other lot were hyper motivated to try and do everything they could to fit in and to belong, which is a very, very fundamental human need.
It makes me wonder, though, how much of that, we talk about nature and nurture a lot when we talk about psychology and neuroscience. I'm a very strong, and full disclosure, my listeners know this, but I am an existential psychologist. That's my training model. I use CBT, but I'm not a deeply CBT person. I also work in a cancer center, and I specialize in end of life and older adults. So in my training, I saw children, but that's not an area where I focus now. Although, interestingly, I have been involved in diagnosing, women in their 60s who never had a diagnosis previously, but clearly qualified for a diagnosis, and just, had exactly what you were talking about, this sort of atypical presentation. And when I say atypical, it's not atypical. It's just not normative because the normative has always been the man. But so that aside, I'm curious because I'm a strong sort of believer in social programming and in deep, deep social pressures. And I believe personally that we live in a very patriarchal society where men have certain pressures on them that are sometimes very strong, but women have a different type of pressure on them, and that gendered difference is deeply learned. That men are raised to believe that they deserve certain things in the world and that they have certain privileges, and women are raised to believe that they must earn certain things in the world and that they don't have certain privileges. And I think that difference is deeply reinforced from the time that we're young. So I'm curious how much of these major differences that you may see in the brain are learned differences.
Well, I absolutely agree with what you said, and in a way, that's what my previous book was about how a gendered world makes a gendered brain, and that's the point. If we learn something, because our brains are plastic, that will actually change the brain. So I'm not a fan of the either nature or nurture camp. I think the two are hugely entangled. And the way in which the brain changes in the face of all sorts of experiences and attitudes, that's really where my focus has been. So we know there are things in the outside world, how girls are socialized differently from boys, and you can see the consequences of that quite easily in the brain. So yes, I think the socialization experiences are very different, and I think that plays a role in what we call the internalizing of the kind of distress that realizing you don't fit into the world will cause us, because, as I say, belonging is a kind of fundamental human need. But some people find a way of dealing with it differently. Some people, well, if I don't fit into the outside world, I'll just be on my own, which is a kind of hyper characterization. But other people are desperate. If I don't fit into the outside world, I must find a way of doing it. And this is where the kind of camouflaging and masking behavior, which is characteristic of women who are diagnosed later, once we discovered it, it's actually characteristic of a very large portion of the autistic community, most of whom are female. And that's where we get into they write little social scripts which they practice in front of the mirror, or they watch other people, particularly popular girls. How do they stand? What is it that makes them popular? And then they try and mimic that behavior. So they are aware. They don't have this kind of automatic social instinct, as I call it, understanding the invisible rules of social behavior. So they try and learn them, and that's from a very young age, which is quite startling when you realise we're looking at 4 and 5-year-old girls who are already aware of the fact that they're, well, mainly because they're called weird or nobody wants to play with them, etc. So they develop these strategies, which you could say on the surface are successful in that they're not identified as having the kind of problems that might get them diagnosed as autistic, but they're actually hugely counterproductive, because as their lives go on, they carry on with these exhausting strategies, and associated with that, depression, suicidal ideation, etc. But still they carry on, which I think is a real measure of how powerful that drive is in that particular group of people.
And it's interesting to think about the amount of distress that forces that type of masking and that type of social scripting starting around age 4 and 5. To me, it makes perfect sense that it starts so young and that you do see such a significant gender differential. And obviously when we talk about these gender differences, just as the caveat for everybody, like so we don't get the emails, we know that there is always a long tail on both of these things. And there are always going to be male individuals who present more extremely than what we're talking about as characteristic of a female autistic kind of brain, and vice versa. Once again, when a young boy is socialized to think that whoever he is perfectly acceptable, and just be yourself, and you can become anything, and don't let anybody put pressure on you to change who you are. And young girls are taught you'd better bend to social norms because there are only so many spots available for women. And, like, you better be competitive for those spots. I mean, we think about a family, and even a family who is quite kind of liberal and educated and aware of, like, gender norms and gender pressures. A little boy and a little girl in the same family, and the little boy falls down and hurts himself, and the little girl is asked to go take care of him. Like, this is the way we treat children, right? So girls are raised from the time they're so young to be socially aware, and to be you'd better be concerned about the people around you, because if you're not, then your role divergence is going to be met with discomfort, or it's gonna be met with punishment. And boys don't have that. They just don't have that.
I think that's there's a great phrase. I think it's Reshma Sojani who founded Girls Who Code to try and get more girls interested in science. It's called "We Raise Our Boys to Be Brave and Our Girls to Be Perfect." And I think that sums up so much of the different pressures that boys and girls are exposed to by what I call the gender bombardment, particularly in the 21st century, I think. And girls are socialized much more not to make a fuss, to fit in, as you say, to be caring towards others, to be nice to each other. Whereas, if there's a ruckus in the playground and the boys are punching each other, people just say, oh, let boys be boys, or typical boy kind of thing. So I think that pressure is certainly part of the issue. It used to be thought that maybe that was the only explanation, that we didn't see so many girls with autism, because they were all camouflaging it because they were being good girls. I think there's more to it than that. I think there is a sort of biological aspect as well, in that I would say, certainly with respect to the more recent work, that the brains of these chameleon type autistic individuals show much higher sensitivity to social rejection, much more self-referencing during social situations. So constant anxiety that, am I doing this right? Will they reject me? Will they spot me as weird, etc.? So I think it's not just a nurture argument.
But couldn't those brain differences be learned?
I think that's perhaps where we're slightly talking at cross preferences, cross purposes. Sorry, is that how we learn things is by changing the brain.
Right.
So, if, for example, you learn to play a musical instrument, or juggle, or play Tetris, that will change your brain, and what will happen is that you will then get good at your third foreign language, or playing the violin, or playing Tetris, because your brain will then change to better support that particular type of behavior.
Yeah, so it's sort of a chicken and an egg question, right? Like, are these examples, these kind of chameleon brains that you mentioned, who do have more activity in these areas that are, I guess, related to social rejection and some of
Yeah.
the emotional experiences, are they like that, and then it becomes reinforced, or do they become like that because of the gender
Yeah.
pressures that are put on babies from the time they're born?
Yes, million dollar question.
And it's probably both, right?
Yeah, difficult to see how one would answer it. Well, I mean, obviously, you could do a thought experiment with you took a newborn child, and who knows, in the future we might have amazing technological advances that you could map how that brain develops in the world to which that child is born.
Mhm.
And that would be intriguing. I think what you'd find is that, I mean, my mantra is every brain is different from every other brain.
Yeah.
And the key issue with respect to what those differences mean to the individuals, that then brings us into why are some people diagnosed as autistic? Why do some people become depressed? Why are some people extraordinarily creative, for example?
Yeah. What about these sort of what we might again in the very pathologizing medical model call comorbidities, or maybe we can use some different terminology and say related behavioral patterns and traits. What kinds of things do you often see in your research accompany the autistic brain? Maybe sometimes people are, like you mentioned, more depressed or anxious, and maybe some people, it's not really about a diagnosis, but it's about a creativity or a skill set or something. Where do you see those parallels?
Well, I think very much it's to do with how the brain networks are formed. And that's actually a very difficult question to explore because very often they are only formed for a very fleeting instance in the face of a particular issue. So these networks are forming and unforming all the time. And for some individuals, if the formations of connections can be much more fixed, I'm hesitating slightly because the term hardwired is something I get very worried about
Yeah,
in the
I do
way
too. Yeah, I'm always like,
the way
wait,
it's
wait.
been used in the past. But it could be that people who have connections which form in more unusual ways, in some cases that might lead to quite bizarre patterns of behavior. They might perhaps have hallucinations or delusions. But for other people, it may be they manage to put together information in a completely new way, but which solves a particular problem. And Simon Baron Cohen has written quite a lot about this in his book, The Pattern Seekers, which suggests that autistic people have powerful ways of seeing different patterns in the information that they're processing in the world. And sometimes those different patterns will lead to amazing breakthroughs in science or music or mathematics, etc.
Yeah, it makes sense because there are maybe, I don't want to say certain things that are suppressed, but it's just about attention, right? In a lot of ways. So much of our cognition, whether we're talking about memory or whether we're talking about eureka moments, so much of our cognition is about what we attend to. And if our brains developed in a particular way that our attention is focused over here and is able to suppress any sort of interference from over there, we may be more skilled at identifying things that get maybe lost in the signal to noise ratio for somebody who has a more neurotypical brain. I'm sure there's other explanations, but I can imagine that might be part of it.
Yes. Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I think the phrase attention to detail was something which was very popular in the sort of 1980s, 1990s, saying this is one of autism, the basis of one of the strengths that autistic people showed, amazing attention to detail, which is linked to the kind of restricted interest aspects of the autism diagnosis. Um, but psychologists like Uta Frith, for example, were trying to pare it back to basic perceptual processes and saying these people see much more detail than we do because our brains, again, with this predictive coding, we kind of smear over tiny little changes because they're not that important.
Yeah, we use shortcuts all the time and go, okay, that sort of approximates the thing, move on. Whereas somebody else is like, is it the thing? Let's look at every detail to make sure it's the thing.
That's right. And sometimes it's almost as though they can't not do that. They have this hyper focus on all sorts of details, which, I mean, if we look back at the sort of history of classification, for example, talking about psychiatric classification, but things like botanic classification, geology, astronomers, etc., people who were able to focus intensively for long periods of time on tiny, tiny little nuanced differences, which were sufficient to allow them to distinguish one sort of plant from another, for example, or one sort of rock from another. That's the basis of a lot of how we got to understand the world, because we do need to categorize things, but sometimes we just don't notice the things which differentiate one bird, plant, rock, whatever, from the other.
It's interesting because it's almost like with every skill comes a difficulty, and I, for example, have such the opposite type of brain where I would really struggle if I were a naturalist, a century ago, trying to put things into boxes, because what I love to grapple with is whether the boxes should be the boxes they are. And I'm so interested in this constructed reality. And I love the gray zone and that fuzzy demarcation problem. Whereas I can imagine with some individuals with autism where they may have that like deep skill set to say, okay, this minute detail puts it over here versus over there. The times when they're on the line may be quite distressing. The times when it's quite difficult to say it's neither this nor this because it's both and neither is probably a very distressing experience. And I love that experience.
Yes, they hate open-ended questions, for example.
Right.
Yes. Could we have a true or false, please? Kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah. I think that's absolutely right. And I've seen that. I had somebody I was working with who loved the brain imaging scans of his that I showed him, and he took them away and brought back his sort of beautiful cartoon based on one of the scans I'd given him. And I thought, oh, that's really nice. It's lovely. And next time I came across him, it was at some event for autism skills, where he had a whole table covered with all of these images. And he said, oh, I'm so glad to see you. You started off this wonderful hobby I have, but I want you to have one of these pictures. Which one would you like? And I looked at them, and bearing in mind that I do spend quite a lot of time scanning brain images, looking for
Mhm.
details, they all looked exactly the same to me.
Yeah.
So it was actually quite difficult to say, oh, I prefer that one.
That's so
um,
funny.
yeah. But of course, it can be a strength as well as a distraction.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And that, I guess that leads to an important question, which is this question about it comes back to categorization and pattern recognition. So you spend a lot of time scanning the brains of these wildly different people, but different people who are all on the spectrum versus let's call them a matched control, somebody who we know is not on the spectrum but has a lot of features otherwise that are similar, demographic features. We know that there are certain diagnoses. Let's say antisocial personality disorder comes to mind because I have read a little bit of this research and talked to some of these researchers where, by and large, not always, but by and large, you could take a stack of brain scans of somebody with antisocial personality disorder and a stack of brain scans with matched controls, and you could look at them and say, okay, these people go over here, these people go over there. And it doesn't always work, but it kind of works. And with AI, we're getting better and better at it. Do we have that discriminatory power? Is there a pattern that you can see on neuroimaging and predict whether somebody is autistic or not, just based on the way their brain looks or acts?
I'm saying not yet, but I'm
Okay.
kind of hesitating because it implies that there is something we will find. I
Mhm.
think the issue is very much to do with um, functions and not structures. And I very
Okay.
often say when I'm arguing about the whole myth of the female brain, for example, that neuroscience has painted itself into a corner because it's only been looking at the size of structures. And actually, if if we actually focused on how the brain functions, but in real time, we would be much more likely to be able to spot the differences. So again, interested in spot the differences. But it may also be that the differences actually are different for everybody. And Daphne Joel's work looking at the mosaic brain, where initially she looked at over, I think it was 1,400 brain scans, some of males, some of females, to see if there was a way of categorizing these brain scans neatly or even semi-neatly into two groups, male and female. Wasn't possible. She was looking at over 100 different characteristics, and in each of the brains, there was a different mosaic. You might, I think it was something like less than 6%, there was some kind of consistency, but otherwise, all of us. And again, I think this comes back to the idea of, a gendered world makes a gendered brain, for example. It doesn't have to be gendered, but the world everybody experiences is different for everybody. And I think the key issue, for example, is you could look at brain scans of identical twins and they would be different.
Absolutely.
So I think that's a different way of answering your question, to say, maybe we shouldn't be looking for grouping people into, is this person autistic or is this person not autistic? It could almost be, is this person having a lot of difficulty with functioning in the social world? Comes right back to what we talked about at the beginning. And let's see if that's something that we could identify in one group of brains as opposed to the other.
Because ultimately, I think it raises two questions for me. The first one is kind of over here on the left, and it's more of a thought experiment. But with the advent of large language models and artificial intelligence, especially like neural nets, like, are we going to get better at that sort of discriminatory stuff because the pattern recognition is, beyond that of a human? And probably the answer is yes. But
Yes.
over here, it's, now that we have that information, what are we even doing with it, right? Because
Yeah.
autism is not a disease. It's not an infection. It's not something where we go, here's a pill that you take for your autistic brain. Like, and yes, there are, quote, interventions and treatments, but we also know that historically, a lot of those were and continue to be, in my view, quite damaging. A lot of the interventions are, how can we help people with autism pretend to be less autistic and sort of exist in a normative world better? My view is the reason for the diagnosis, especially in, I guess, more severe cases, is so that parents and caretakers and other individuals can develop skills for helping that person have a higher quality of life, but not, okay, this person's autistic, let's teach them how to pretend they're not autistic, which I think so often has been the quote intervention in the past.
Yes. Which is bizarre in a way, because that's almost what the camouflages are doing.
Exactly.
And then you come to them and say, let's take you to these social skills training courses where we teach you to watch how people, what gestures they make and what jokes are, etc., etc. So yes, I think, first of all, yes, I think absolutely we're going to get better with artificial intelligence at spotting differences between brain scans. I think the issue always is, why are we asking this question? Which comes back to what you were saying, is what is it we're hoping to get out of being able to put this pile of brain scans on one side and this pile of brain scans on the other? And I think it could almost be more like personalized medicine, that is a move in physical medicine. Could be hugely helpful with, for example, that less abled individuals on the spectrum, so perhaps non-verbal. It could give you some kind of insight into the triggers, which are one of the biggest problems. What is it that causes this person to have a meltdown? How could we ensure that their world includes the minimum amount of these triggers? And so that I think that could be very useful, but it is going to involve getting away from our old-fashioned questions. Like, it comes back to the idea: is this a male or is this a female? Can we tell the difference between their brains, etc.? Actually, not a terribly useful question, as it turns out. And when you start to say, why are we asking this question, you then get into all sorts of political arguments as well.
Yeah, this sort of individualistic Western ideal of, oh, here's a person with a label. How do we now teach this person to better conform to societal standards? Instead of saying, okay, here's a person with a label. How can we better, at least, yeah, we're not going to change society. Maybe, through movements, we'll see small changes, but how can we at least adapt their micro environment to better accommodate their differences?
Yes. Well, I think, the sensory performances in theatres, for example, are a great example. Autistic people would love to go and see a particular play, but if it includes a lot of very loud noises or bright lights, they can't do that. So that's a very simple change that can be made. We're coming up for World Autism Day is on April the 2nd, and the whole of April is a World Autism Acceptance Month. So I think that's an aspect too. so that people will understand why some people behave in a particular way. I mean, this argument about stimming, why autistic people are, one of the treatments they have is how to stop stimming.
Right. Ugh,
You know, my belief is, and this comes back to the whole predictive brain thing, is that they need to do it because they
absolutely.
haven't got a brain which picks out the regularities in the world for them. So they have to make their world as predictable as possible. And that could be, repetitive, hugely repetitive, very simple movements. Rocking, again, for example, something which imposes some kind of regularity on a terrifyingly irregular world.
Yeah. And for us to not only be more aware and accepting, but also, it's funny, I have seen some autistic folks kind of in my other world, like as a podcaster when I'm doing live events, where I think the therapy that they have is so interesting. Whereas instead of, masking, what they'll do is they'll walk up to get their book signed, for example, and they'll say, "Oh, by the way, I'm autistic and I may see things that are inappropriate or I may not know when to stop talking. And if you just tell me, okay, our time is done, I won't be offended." And so they'll give me this script at the front. So it's basically like, I am who I am. I'm letting you know that. I would love some feedback from you because I'm not good at, I'm not good at reading your cues. And I don't know. I just always love that because I'm like, oh, great. Thanks for letting me know. And then I can say, okay, now you're done. You can move on to the next, station or something. They're like, oh, thank you, and move on. What cool training, which has not been, I think, the focus in the past.
I think that's absolutely right, and it's the kind of identity issue which I think is very
Yeah,
strong in the
yeah,
autism experience to say,
yeah.
actually, this is who I am. This is
Love it.
I am autistic, and so this is how I will behave. And
Yeah,
but I think it should be a two-way process. So
absolutely.
Damien Milton's double empathy problem. We spend a lot of time training autistic people to try and fit in.
To
How
fit in
about
our world.
training
Yeah.
neurotypical people to say there are people who are different? And I think this would be really important in very early years education. I found
True.
talking to some of the younger girls about the bullying they'd experienced really harrowing. And you just think, and some of them talking about, these are adults who'd experienced it as a child, saying it was like a trauma. Their early years at school were an ongoing trauma, and a lot of their current difficulties were like PTSD. And you just think, education, that's almost more important, I think.
I agree.
Classic education. But just to say to everybody, be kind. Some people are different, and part of their difference is being very distressed when they're called weird or whatever. So how about dialing back on that?
Yeah.
And actually, you think actually that should be true of everybody. You shouldn't call anybody weird.
Exactly, like, that's the thing, empathy training as children, if we could learn in our class, and it takes 2 things, right? It takes dropping the old model of pulling kids that were, quote, "different" out and hiding them, and it takes integrating like, integrating our classrooms. It's just like we got the first part, and we really did make a big change towards integration historically, at least in kind of American academic, theory, but we forgot the second part, which was if we are gonna have these very deeply integrated classrooms, we have to be educated on people's differences and on acceptance and celebration of those differences. And we don't do it with boys and girls. We don't do it with diagnoses. We don't do it with neurodivergence.
It's like the problem of diversity and inclusion
Yes.
initiatives which don't include inclusion.
Yes.
And anyway, perhaps we better not
Yeah.
go on to that. But anyway,
No,
yeah.
it's so true.
So,
There are so
so
many parallels here, and it's basic empathy training too, because like you mentioned, okay, some people are different. Actually, we're all different. And if we work really hard to identify our own areas of difference and struggle and stop sort of sublimating them and hiding them and bring them into the light and work on how we can better accept ourselves, we will be better able to accept our neighbors. Then all of a sudden, I think more boys are gonna be showing their feelings and processing their feelings at a young age, more kids are going to be adapting or adjusting their behavior towards those who don't, quote, fit in the norm or fit in their niche or their clique, and their social circles will broaden and expand. Whether we're talking about immigrants or queer kids or kids who are neurodivergent, there's just going to be a celebration of those differences. And I think more, quote, normative kids who are raised to be deeply normative are going to be more open to say, I have some questions about my, gender or my sexuality, instead of suppressing that in order to fit a social script. Because we're all different.
Yes. A great strap line.
Yeah. So the last thing, I know we're running low on time and there's a million other things we could talk about, but the one thing we didn't touch on, which I do think is important, and yes, it's a bit of a review because I had Angela Saini on the show like a million years ago talking about this very topic. We don't include women enough in our studies. You do, right? And that's a big change here.
Well, my book starts with a confession. Yes. It was actually a real eye-opener because part of my work with people like Angela Saini, for example, is to challenge bias in science and say a lot of the research saying there were differences between males and females is because of an ongoing belief that there were differences. So it was like a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the gendered brain, or Gender in Our Brains, that I wrote earlier, was really saying males and females are more similar than they are different, and we should perhaps acknowledge that. Anyway, that then caused a lot of consternation. Myself and Cordelia Fine and other people were writing about that and saying we were putting women's health at risk for preventing sex difference research, which actually was nothing, certainly not what we were aiming to do. We were just saying it was so important that it should be done well. The comeback was always, if you say there's no differences between males and females, your underlying research into brain-based conditions where there are clear differences, where more males get Parkinson's disease and more females get Alzheimer's disease. And if you're disrespecting this kind of research, how badly you're treating women. And there'd always be a list of conditions which are more true of males than females, or females than males. And the top of the list was always autism. It's autism is a male condition. There must be, must respect research into sex differences in autism, etc. So I thought, well, fair enough, given that I was an autism researcher, which is why I was a person who scanned large numbers of autistic individuals, very few of whom were female. And my kind of unconscious rationalization was, I'm actually just interested in how the brain works. I don't think it's relevant whether or not this person is male or female. And anyway, male autism is more common in males anyway. Then, so I thought, I'll go and have a look at this research. And, if there is this research saying there are differences between autistic male brains and autistic female brains, I ought to know about it and see if it's good. And that's when I discovered that actually there wasn't any research into these differences, because all neuroscientists were doing research only with males. So that was when I realized I was guilty of doing the kind of thing that I was criticizing people for doing.
But we need that. We need those moments of awareness and self-reflection. And so I think one of the big takeaways here, there's so many important takeaways, is we cannot know what we need to know unless we are inclusive in our research. We have to make sure that when we talk about the prototypical or the normative, that we are not talking about the cis white male as normative, which has been all of our modern scientific history.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And again, one of the sort of areas of confession was that almost all of the research I referred to was about white individuals, partly because that's where all the research is focused, which is not a good thing, but certainly an acknowledgement that the kind of intersectionality is really important, and how the difficulties experienced by white females in getting recognized as being autistic are magnified many times in Black autistic females.
Oh, yeah.
And something, obviously that needs to be discussed. But I think I'd already gone over. No, I was going to say gone over my word limit, but that wasn't the reason. I confess. I think it was just that there isn't very much, which is a bad thing, and hopefully there will be more. I mean, there was a lot of the triggering of discovering missing autistic women was from very articulate autistic females who wrote amazingly powerful personal testimonies about their life history and describing, what being diagnosed as autistic in their 30s, 40s, 50s even had meant to them. And that really was a wake-up call for the whole of autism, because clinicians had gone on with producing tests where the diagnostic dice were loaded, more likely to find boys and girls because you're asking about boy type behavior. Teachers, teachers have said to me, I've taught for 30 years and I've never seen a girl with autism or an autistic girl. And you think, well, they will have been there possibly every year of every class you've been teaching, but they weren't aware of their own bias. In a way, I wasn't consciously aware of my own bias in the kind of research I was doing.
So listen, I've already kind of kept you longer than, there's a million more questions, and I know there's things that we missed. Is there anything that sticks out to you that we definitely need to make sure that we mention?
I think the only thing is, and I would say this wouldn't I, is the brain models that were developed in the men-only research years really need revisiting quite powerfully, partly because I was looking at the social reward system in the brain, or have been looking at research into that, because obviously that's been a focus of people interested in autism, saying, maybe they're not social because they don't find being social that necessary. And when the early models were saying, oh yes, look, there's lack of activity in this part of the social brain, how about we stimulate that bit of the brain and see if that makes people more social? That's a whole other area of discussion. But it's also a part of the brain which in female autistic individuals is hyperactive. So, you have to speculate on what would that have been like if we'd kind of gone on with this idea that they've got underactive social brains and let's stimulate the social brains, when possibly a good 40% of the people you might have been applying this to, in a kind of futuristic type experiment, actually already had hyperactive social brains. So I think that's what I'm saying. It's a very important question. Understanding the bias is very important, not just as a kind of philosophical nicety, if you like, but actually for the kind of practical implications of the conclusions you come to.
Absolutely. Gosh, well, I hope that for those listening today, whether this is an area that you haven't really spent a lot of time thinking about, hopefully this opened your mind a bit, or if you are one of the hundreds of thousands, probably millions of individuals who either are yourself neurodivergent or know somebody, have somebody in your family, have a dear friend, have a partner who is neurodivergent, that this, opened up your thinking as well. I have to thank you so much, Gina, for being here with us. Everyone, the book is Off the Spectrum: Why the Science of Autism Has Failed Women and Girls. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the great questions. Very helpful.
Oh, I'm so glad. And everybody listening, thank you for coming back week after week. I'm really looking forward to the next time we all get together to talk nerdy.